Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Coming up now is Mr. Dale Buckner, CEO of Global Guardian. Dale's retired Special Forces Green Beret officer, founder, president, and CEO of Global Guardian, and he's lived and operated in over 70 countries globally. As the world gets more dangerous and as your operations become more global in nature, Global Guardian is an exceptional resource to help your employees travel safely and securely during these challenging times. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dale Buckner.
Stephen, thank you. Next slide, please. So today we're going to go through, as you can see here on the title, an update on COVID-19 and kind of state of the world. Although I will be a little bit US-centric today, I think obviously the four things that are top of mind for everyone involved here is COVID, the economy, what's going on with social injustice and the protests, and then lastly, the election is forefront in all of our minds, as all these topics are on the radio in your car, they're on the news when you're online, and you're bombarded with it on TV. So it's everywhere, and I know everyone has some level of knowledge of all these topics. My intent today is to give you a slightly different optic on all of these topics. Of note, I'm not briefing you from a political position. I'm not briefing red, blue, Republican, Democrat, independent. I'm not briefing you from a religious context. This is not through the view of a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, a Muslim, or anyone else. And that today, in today's world, is really, really difficult. And I know, based on where people's leanings are, that I will offend some in some things I say and offend the other side on others, and it's just the nature of the environment we're in. That being said, I'm going to brief what I believe is factual without any influence from the outside. Next slide, please. So as you look at this is obviously dated. We're a little over 27 million cases now in the world on the left-hand side. Of note, as you look at those top 15 from the US down to Saudi Arabia, the one thing that strikes me as an American is that 7 of the 15 top countries in the world are all in the Western Hemisphere. They're all within our hemisphere, which is a bit striking when you think about the population center and the fact the United States is a relatively small portion of the world, and then look at our hemisphere across the board. The other thing that strikes me, and this is again dated, India went from number 3 last week, it bumped up to number 2. Why should that get your interest? In my mind, a lot of our clients do an enormous amount of business in India. India is almost the country of choice for an enormous amount of outsourcing of services for US corporations. So when you see that, knowing that the United States has the largest infection population and now is followed by one of its largest outsourced partners, it should kind of raise a red flag for you. On the right-hand side of this, as you look at the numbers, we're up over 198,000 on deaths globally as of this morning. And in the US, we're 189,000 plus. And unfortunately, you're starting to see we're headed towards, before a vaccine is created, distributed, we're probably looking at almost 500,000 dead Americans, which is a staggering number. To put that in context, to just give you some kind of granular compare and contrast, there were 2,911 Americans killed in 9/11. That's 64 9/11s. There were 2,403 Americans killed in the Pearl Harbor attack. That's 78 Pearl Harbors. And lastly, the global war on terrorism that started in Afghanistan in 2001. We're now still in Afghanistan. We're still in Iraq. We're still operating in Syria. 6,967 service members were killed in the longest conflict in our history. As of today, we've had 27 times the amount of Americans killed than we have lost in the longest war in our history. These numbers are quite staggering when you start to think about that. Next slide. There is good news here. As you look at this, we have started to see the flattening of the curve, Europe, Asia, even ahead of us. Although the US, you're starting to see the numbers are starting to come down. So there is a bit of hope here. That being said, Germany, France, Spain, and Eastern Europe have had spikes. And we've seen spikes in Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Australia in the last 3 weeks. My point is, this is fragile. Every time we get 2 steps forward, we seem to go 5 steps back. It's a fragile balance of control, but there is signs that we've had some effectiveness here. 2, you're seeing this news every day. There is a rush for a vaccine. It's the right thing to do. There are people that are as optimistic as we could see it as early as November. There's people and others within that sphere and that industry saying probably more like January, February. I don't think anyone truly has the answer, but the fact that we're bracketing that window of time is very encouraging. Testing. We're now in the US have tested over 83 million Americans, and we're now testing over 500,000 individuals a day. That's great news. In an ideal world, we'd be testing 3 million a day. So we're seeing increases, and that's what we want, but we're not there yet. Ultimately, I think all of us have a better understanding what the virus is, how it spreads. We're better informed than ever. And I think that leads to you're seeing more utilization and cultural adaptation of using masks on planes and in public spaces. And it's not what it was when we started in March, April, where people were kind of pessimistic. I think culturally we're seeing a good response overall. We're starting to see less and less crowds, although you see what's happening with colleges. You see what's happening in the Sturgis example. There's no doubt those become super spreaders, and it just is what it is. If people gather, people die. So those numbers have gone down in large gatherings. Obviously, sports is returning, and you're seeing the NBA very successfully navigate this without crowds. I think the NFL will be much the same. So we're seeing those things in our society come back. And then lastly, we are seeing travel corridors. Europe is open to Europeans. Asia is open to Asians. There's a travel bridge between New Zealand and Australia that's open and doing quite well. So these pockets of success are all hopeful signs. Next slide. Key travel lessons learned, and I keep harping on this. I'm doing about 6 webinars a week. I think if you're an HR director, a security manager, or a COO, that you have to reflect on these things going back to March. Number one, I think if your duty of care plan, you believe that the US State Department is part of the get out of jail free card when bad things happen abroad, you're missing the point. The US State Department and embassies abroad are not trained, manned, or equipped to evacuate Americans at scale. They're not. They're very good on one-on-ones when Americans get arrested or there's medical evacuation for 1 or 2 people. At small scale, the embassies are incredibly valuable. Don't want to take away from the people and what they do. They're great patriots for serving. That being said, understand and recognize the reality. The US State Department struggled for over 3 months trying to evacuate over 50,000 Americans. And there are still to this day Americans stranded that haven't been able to get back. Ultimately, that needs to be recognized because you have to understand you cannot rely on the government to get you out of a bind, and this is a perfect example. Commercial evacuations failed at scale because at the end of the day, the airlines are businesses. If it wasn't in their best interest to fly aircraft empty to get Americans out, and the government wasn't paying for that, you can understand they're a business. They're there to make money and create value for their shareholders. So enormous amount of failure on the commercial side. And then lastly, here in the US, and this is the political part, and I don't want to politicize this, and I certainly am not trying to get people elevated that disagree with this. But what I would say from a ex-military, ex-government standpoint is that right now we have no standard in the states. The governors are all doing what they think is right. There's no standard for the country. It's a problem. When Delta Airlines has a different policy than American or United, which is different than Southwest, which is different than JetBlue or Alaska, that's a problem because you don't create confidence without one standard in the travel community. When the US FAA has not put out a standard for the country, it's a problem. When TSA has barely engaged, when this started in March, we really believe you are going to see this, the creation of TSA at scale, at speed, like we did after 9/11. Remember, before 9/11, we didn't have TSA. We didn't have screening. We didn't have any of that. We really thought we were going to see an explosion in the screening of TSA to create a standard, to create confidence in the travel space. It has not happened. So the takeaway here is without a national standard, all we're doing is prolonging getting ourselves back and moving, and it's a problem. Ultimately, medical insurance and medical evacuation platforms did not cover COVID-19. HR directors need to understand, they need to understand the fine print on those policies. They believe they are covered for these things. Then something like this happens and they realize they have no coverage whatsoever for a pandemic, and it's a problem. And then lastly, travel tracking and alerts. Travel tracking and alerts are not duty of care. They are one small part of duty of care. But if you think just because you track your travelers and you get alerts, somehow that's safeguarding people, it has minimal effect. Because once you're in the next Paris attacks, the next Sri Lanka bombing, the next hurricane zone, my question to you is, okay, you alerted your people, but now they're stranded. What's the so what in that? If you don't have an answer to how you actually get them out of Paris, out of Sri Lanka, out of Wuhan after COVID breaks, that's where the rubber meets the road. So I would question your definition and relook this while we have a pause in global travel. Next slide. I won't spend a lot of time here, but I just want to alert everyone to this. And obviously in corporate America, you've seen mass furloughs, mass layoffs. The economy is clearly in recession. This is what I would say. You do not need an economics degree or a finance degree to understand that the United States economy has shrunk the largest in the history since we've been counting. Right now, our entire economy is being held up by the Fed. We are printing free money, and you can only do that for so long. We are doing this at a cost of our future. Make no mistake, it's real. Ultimately, there is a financial reckoning coming. The stock market is not the US GDP. It is not the economy. There's a despairing view of this. I think you're going to see a correction in the stock market very soon that will support that. And eventually that correction will mirror what's really going on within the country. Ultimately, this is not a good news story. This is going to take years and years to get out of with the proper management. Ultimately, as you look at this, the US government cannot hold up the country forever. And if we don't see a vaccine very soon in the spring of 2021, this is going to create real enduring damage. And we all need to watch where this goes. Next slide. We're almost done. I have just a couple slides left. The United States security situation. How did we get here? All of you are incredibly knowledgeable. Again, as you see this online, you hear it in the radio in your car, and you see it in the news every day. As you look at this, a couple of comments. Again, this is political, and I don't want people to get upset, but the reality is we don't think that the movement of injustice tied to police brutality, we don't think it's going away. I think it's here to stay. I think we're going to hit a tipping point. I think ultimately the upside of this is we will see retraining of our police. We will see changes in policies. That does not mean that we believe in defund the police whatsoever. I don't think that's real. I don't think that's a solution. I think that we should retrain our police, and we should acknowledge that just like any organization, the organization you're in now has good people, it has okay people, and it has some bad apples. Every organization on the planet does. Ultimately, you're never going to take this out of the human condition, and human beings policing other human beings is always going to be difficult. Ultimately, I think that we have to recognize there's a change coming, and I don't think it's going to go away, no matter where you sit politically. Obviously, with the economy and people being laid off and the government welfare extension, all of those things are affecting people's individual households, and obviously with the high unemployment, which has been coming down, which is great. But I think we're hovering around 10% for the near future, which is very high. It's going to create problems. This is that fifth bullet down, loss of confidence in the social contract. This is really the macro issue we have right now. If the United States people do not trust the FBI, do not trust DOD, they lose confidence in CIA, they lose confidence in Homeland Security, if they lose confidence in the police, if they lose confidence in our government, once you break that social contract with the population itself, you cannot get it back. This is a dangerous, dangerous rabbit hole. And the path we're on right now on losing that contract and confidence with our society is very, very scary. It's the worst I've seen in my lifetime. I'm 52 years old. I am hoping that no matter what happens in the election, if Trump gets reelected, I hope he doesn't feel pressure. He's in a re-election cycle. He can bring the temperature of the country down. If Biden is elected, I hope he can bring the temperature down in the country, which goes back to the very first bullet. And then lastly, I would say this, and I don't mean to be overly alarmist, but I think you're already seeing it. Desperate people do desperate things, combined with the lack of economic growth, combined with COVID, combined with what's happening in our society. This is a recipe for, and we've already seen it, we're seeing spikes in child abuse, spouse abuse, larceny, car theft, and then of course murder, which has historically over the last 2 decades been going down. Ultimately, my takeaway is this for corporate America. Number one, if you're operating within these pockets of real violence and real friction points, if you will, I think that you have to recognize you are more on your own than ever. And the privatization of security and intel and medical support is only going to grow as it is being proved out that the government cannot solve these problems for us. Next slide. And this is my last slide. And this is just to reiterate that point. As you look at this, and I put this on the left side, the good news is the murder rate and crime in this country at the macro level continues to fall. That is a wonderful news story. We should be proud of that as a country. We should be happy that that is the case. That being said, as I stated in the previous slide, desperate people do desperate things. And as you look at the right side, we're seeing murder up across in pockets of violence in different cities across the country, anywhere from 45 to almost 200% in some cases as this continues. And these slides are a little bit dated as this was June 2020. I don't think this trend is going to go away until we get the temperature of the nation down and we start to get our economy back and we start to get people back to work and we start to get over what we're seeing on the social injustice piece of what's happening in the country. So ultimately, this is not a good news story, which leads back to if you're in one of these pockets, I think you're more on your own and you're going to have to do this. And hiring an 18-hour an hour guard who has no training with high turnover is not going to be a solution. It's got to be holistic, it's got to be high-end people, and it's got to be the use of technology, all fully integrated, as you try and protect your infrastructure and your people at either whether your workplace, your manufacturing site, whatever business you might be in, or as a family. So I'll conclude with this. My 3 takeaways are: 1, I don't believe COVID is going away anytime soon. Even if we had a vaccine tomorrow, it's going to take some time to get it out and to create confidence worldwide. 2, I do not believe travel is bouncing back until, in real terms, it's not going to bounce back until we have a vaccine. And even then, it will take years to come back to the rates that we had previously. And then 3, I do think the continued privatization of security, medical, and less reliance on insurance, which is not going to cover these major events. And we've already witnessed that here several times over the last few decades with storms, fires, and now COVID. So I'll pause there. I look forward to the questions, comments in the roundtables, and I look forward to interacting with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dale. As always, very insightful information. And everybody, you'll want to definitely join Dale in his deeper dive session. You'll glean a lot of information there. It's always the highest rated program we have. Dale, thanks again. Great to see you. Best of luck with everything you have going on.
Thank you, sir.